The end of the American Civil War marked a turning point not only for the nation, but also for thousands of men and women who had once been enslaved. The country stood at a crossroads, bruised by years of conflict, yet alive with the promise of new beginnings. Across the rolling fields of the South, whispers of opportunity began to spread, opportunity not bound by the chains of slavery or the rigid hierarchy of the old world. For many, that promise lay beyond the horizon, in the vast and untamed lands of the American West. Imagine the scene: families packing their few belongings, mothers clutching children, fathers carrying farming tools and cherished heirlooms, all driven by a shared dream of independence. The West was more than a direction on the map. It was a symbol of possibility. Here, the soil seemed to promise freedom, the open skies whispered of dignity, and the endless plains invited those who dared to start anew. It was a place where courage could take root, and where the future, though uncertain, belonged to those bold enough to claim it. Among these hopeful travelers were thousands of formerly enslaved black men and women. They carried memories of injustice, but also an unshakable determination to build lives defined by their own choices. With resilience forged through generations of struggle, they envisioned communities where their children could learn freely, where their families could own land, and where their labor would be for their own prosperity, not someone else's gain. This westward migration was not just about survival. It was about reclaiming identity and rewriting destiny. The settlers faced hardships that tested their resolve. Harsh weather, scarce resources, and the unknown dangers of frontier life. Yet these pioneers pressed forward, driven by a belief that freedom meant more than the absence of bondage. It meant the ability to create, to grow, and to shape their own future. They were not simply seeking land or work. They were chasing the promise of equality and self-determination. Today, their journey still speaks to us. It reminds us that hope can outshine adversity, and that the human spirit is capable of extraordinary courage when faced with change. Their story is a powerful chapter of American history, one that challenges us to reflect on our own dreams and the paths we are willing to take to achieve them. If you find inspiration in these untold stories and believe that history still has lessons to share, please support this channel. Like this video, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a journey through the past that continues to shape our present. Your engagement helps keep these powerful narratives alive, ensuring that the voices of those who dared to dream are never forgotten. But as these determined families pushed westward, carrying with them the weight of hard-won freedom and the fragile hope of a better tomorrow, they soon discovered that the promise of the frontier was not yet fully theirs to claim. The land itself seemed boundless, miles of prairie grass bending in the wind like a sea of possibility, yet the laws of the young nation still bore the scars of the era that had only just ended. 4 years before the Civil War erupted, Congress had passed the Homestead Act of 1862, a bold vision meant to open millions of acres to settlers willing to farm and cultivate the soil. On paper it sounded like the very path to independence that so many formerly enslaved men and women longed for. Simple idea: work the land, live in it, improve it, and after 5 years it would be yours. But in practice, the gates of that opportunity were not swung open for everyone. The law, shaped in a time when the nation still wrestled with the question of who counted as fully American, effectively shut out those whose freedom had only recently been recognized. For black men and women who had endured the nightmare of slavery, it was a bitter revelation. Freedom without the means to truly build a life was a freedom still incomplete. Yet history has a way of bending toward those who refuse to give up. The war's end unleashed a new political struggle, one that reached from the halls of Congress to the dusty trails of the frontier. The same spirit of determination that drove these pioneers westward now found allies among lawmakers who sought to give substance to the ideals proclaimed in the nation's founding. In 1866, just a year after the last cannons fell silent, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act, It was a landmark declaration, boldly affirming that every person born in the United States, regardless of color or previous condition of servitude, was a citizen entitled to the same rights as any other. Among those rights was the crucial ability to acquire and hold property, a step that transformed freedom from an abstract promise into something tangible, something that could be measured in acres of soil and the harvests of future years. For the formerly enslaved who gazed westward, this was more than legislation. It was the opening of a door that had long been barred. The momentum continued with the ratification of the 14th Amendment 2 years later, written into the very Constitution. It reinforced the principle that citizenship and equal protection under the law were not privileges to be granted or withheld at whim, but fundamental guarantees. Suddenly the same wide plains that had once seemed reserved for others became a landscape of possibility for black pioneers. The prairie winds that whispered through tall grasses no longer carried only the dreams of white homesteaders. They now bore the hopes of men and women determined to prove that liberty could be lived, not merely proclaimed. The law had shifted, and with it the meaning of the journey west deepened. It was no longer just an escape from the violence and discrimination of the South. It was an act of claiming space, of staking a rightful place in the nation's unfolding story. Still, legal rights did not erase the hardships of reality. Those who traveled to the frontier had to navigate not only the physical trials of an unforgiving landscape, but also the lingering prejudice of neighbors who resisted sharing opportunity. Yet the change in law gave these settlers a powerful tool: the recognition that their claim to land was as valid as anyone else. This acknowledgement, enshrined in both statute and constitution, turned their westward migration into something larger than individual ambition. It became a collective assertion that the promise of America of equality, of self-determination belonged to them as well. As wagons creaked across the endless grasslands and families built homes from sod and timber, every fence post hammered into the earth and every furrow cut into the soil stood as a quiet testimony to that hard-won right. Their very presence on the land became a living argument for the ideals that the Civil War had been fought to define. Each sunrise over the plains marked not only a new day of toil, but also another step in transforming the nation's vision of freedom into reality. For these pioneers, the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and the 14th Amendment were not distant pieces of legal language. They were the sturdy foundation beneath every cabin wall and the invisible promise beneath every seed planted. The laws had finally caught up with the courage of those who had dared to dream, and in doing so, they helped shape a legacy that would outlast the frontier itself. Even with new laws on their side, the reality of life in the post-war South quickly reminded many freed men and women that paper promises could not immediately erase generations of hostility. The ink of the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and the 14th Amendment had barely dried when old patterns of oppression found new disguises. Across towns and plantations, former enslavers and those who had supported the Confederacy worked tirelessly to maintain the old order, replacing chains with intimidation and laws with violence. Night riders and secret societies emerged in the darkness, determined to silence the progress of black communities. For those who had once believed that victory in the war would mean a clear path to equality, the bitter truth settled in. Freedom had been won, but safety and dignity were still under siege. Families who had dreamed of planting roots in the very soil where they had once toiled as captives now faced a grim choice. They could remain and struggle against a rising tide of threats, harsh labor contracts, unjust laws, and the ever-present risk of mob violence, or they could once again gather their courage and seek a place where their aspirations might stand a chance. Many chose the latter, their hearts heavy but their resolve unshaken. They began to look beyond the familiar fields of the South, their eyes drawn toward the vast, open landscapes of the West where the horizon seemed to stretch into a future not yet claimed. Among the wide plains and rolling prairies, Kansas beckoned like a beacon. It was not merely the distance that called to them, though miles of territory lay between the southern states and those golden fields. Kansas carried with it a reputation. A memory still fresh from the turbulent years before the Civil War, when it had earned the name Bleeding Kansas. In that earlier struggle, abolitionists and pro-slavery forces had clashed violently, and from those battles Kansas emerged as a free state for African Americans seeking a haven. This history was more than a tale of conflict. It was proof that the soil itself had been consecrated by a fight for liberty. It was a place where the spirit of resistance and the desire for justice had already been tested and had prevailed. Practical reasons strengthened the pull. The spread of railroads across the state promised not only easier travel but also the means to connect new settlements to markets and opportunities. For families hoping to farm their own land or establish small businesses, these iron pathways offered lifelines of trade and communication. Trains that whistled through the tall prairie grasses carried more than goods. They carried the possibility of belonging to a network of progress. And unlike many regions still steeped in the old prejudices, Kansas boasted a strong tradition of abolitionist support. Churches, civic leaders, and ordinary citizens had risked their lives and reputations to fight against the institution of slavery. Their presence gave reassurance that newcomers seeking freedom would find allies rather than adversaries. The journey itself demanded bravery. Wagons rolled over endless miles of rough road, through changing weather and vast stretches of open land. Parents whispered encouragement to weary children as the sun sank behind the horizon. And at night, under a canopy of stars, families spoke quietly of the life they hoped to build. They carried with them little more than what could be loaded onto a cart: tools, seeds, cherished family Bibles, but they also carried a faith in the idea that life could be different. Kansas represented not only a physical refuge but a chance to prove that equality could be lived in practice, not only argued in courts or written into amendments. As they crossed rivers and plains, the promise of Kansas became more than a dream. It was a destination forged by courage and defined by the shared determination to create a community where dignity could flourish. Every step westward was an act of defiance against the forces that sought to push them back into silence and dependence. The same winds that once swept across the battlefields of the Civil War now stirred the grasses ahead of them, as if to welcome those who would carry forward the unfinished work of freedom. Kansas offered more than land and opportunity. It offered the possibility of a new identity, one chosen and shaped by their own hands. When at last these pioneers set foot on the plains, they did so not as fugitives but as citizens claiming the rights that had so long been denied. Behind them lay a South that could not yet reconcile itself to the reality of emancipation. Ahead lay the open expanse of a state that had already proven its commitment to liberty. Their arrival in Kansas was not merely a relocation. It was the continuation of a movement that began when the first slave resisted bondage, and that would echo through generations. By choosing Kansas, they chose a future where their children could grow beneath the wide Midwestern sky, unshackled by the fear that had haunted their past, and where the promise of America, still imperfect, still contested, could finally be pursued on their own terms. By the time weary travelers reached the windswept plains of northwestern Kansas, their long journey had already become a living testament to hope. They had left behind a South where the memory of war lingered like smoke, and where the promise of freedom was still clouded by the cruelty of prejudice. They had crossed rivers that seemed to stretch forever, and rolled their wagons over miles of unbroken grassland, following the rails and the whispered rumors of opportunity until the land itself seemed to breathe possibility. Yet for all the miles traveled and the hardships endured, their greatest undertaking was only just beginning. Among those who arrived was a small band of visionaries: 6 black men who had once been enslaved, and 1 white land speculator whose shared ambition reached far beyond simply carving out individual homesteads. They wanted to build something no one had seen before. A town born from the determination of people who had known bondage yet refused to be defined by it. A place where black families could own their land, raise their children, and live without the constant shadow of fear. Their names would be etched into the early history of the frontier, like the furrows of a plow, cutting into virgin soil. H. Smith, Rev. Charles Williams, and 4 others whose courage equaled their quiet strength, alongside a white promoter named Arda Hill, who believed that the dream of a thriving community could be made real. These men stood together not because their backgrounds were the same, but because their goals intersected in a single vision. They sought to create a settlement that would serve as a haven of independence and a declaration of what freedom could mean when lived fully. The wide sweep of prairie around them was still mostly unclaimed, its tall grasses rippling in the wind like waves across an inland sea. To many, it might have looked like emptiness. To these founders, it was a blank canvas on which to paint a future. They named their settlement Nicodemus, a choice rich in meaning. Some said it honored a figure from the Gospel of John, the man who came to Jesus under the cover of night seeking spiritual rebirth. Others whispered of an African prince who had freed his people from bondage. Whatever the origin, the name carried the weight of transformation and the promise of a life remade. To those who had escaped the long shadow of slavery, it symbolized a second birth, a chance to create not just homes, but a community bound by shared struggle and shared hope. In the spring of 1877, when the first stakes were driven into the earth, the air itself seemed charged with possibility. But founding a town on the Great Plains demanded more than dreams. The prairie offered beauty and rich soil, but it also tested every ounce of strength and ingenuity. Supplies were scarce and the nearest established settlements were far away. The first homes were not grand wooden houses or brick dwellings, but sod dugout shelters cut from the very earth they claimed as their own. Families worked together, shaping walls from packed prairie soil and covering roofs with grass until the humble homes seemed to grow from the land itself. The settlers endured searing summer heat and brutal winter winds that howled across the plains. But each hardship faced was a silent victory. Each sunrise over the empty horizon a quiet affirmation that they belonged. As word spread of this daring experiment, other black families began to arrive, drawn by the same dream of a place where their labor would belong entirely to them. Wagon after wagon rolled into Nicodemus carrying farmers, craftsmen, and ministers who brought with them not only tools and seeds but songs of faith and the stories of ancestors who had survived the unimaginable. By the next year, the settlement began to take shape beyond those first sod houses. A schoolhouse rose from the prairie, and the sound of children's laughter carried across the open land. Churches provided not only places of worship but also centers for meetings and celebrations. Small stores opened their doors, trading goods and news. And on summer evenings the community gathered for dances and festivals that celebrated both their heritage and their hard-won freedom. Nicodemus was more than a cluster of buildings. It was a statement of defiance and a living embodiment of the idea that liberty must be nurtured through action. For the 6 black founders and their white partner, it became a testament to cooperation and shared purpose. Proof that people of different backgrounds could join together to build something enduring. Every furrow plowed, every seed planted, and every wall raised was a visible sign that the struggle for equality did not end with the Civil War or the ratification of amendments. It continued here, in the sweat of pioneers who turned an untamed prairie into a community of their own making. Under the wide Kansas sky, Nicodemus grew into a symbol for black families across America, a beacon showing what determination could achieve when matched with opportunity. Its story would carry far beyond the prairie, inspiring those who heard of a place where former slaves and their descendants were not merely surviving but thriving, shaping their own destiny against the vast backdrop of the Great Plains. And though many challenges lay ahead, the founding of Nicodemus marked a moment when hope became tangible, when the dream of freedom found a permanent home in the soil of a new land. As the settlement slowly took shape against the sweeping canvas of the Kansas plains, the founders turned their thoughts to a name that would carry the weight of their ambitions and the soul of their journey. They understood that a name was more than a convenient label. It would become the banner beneath which their children would grow. a word that would echo through time and remind future generations why their forebears had dared to cross rivers and prairies in search of a life defined by freedom. After months of hardship, after the building of sod houses that rose from the very earth they sought to claim, these men and women knew that the town's name had to embody both their suffering and their triumph, the grief of their past and the fierce hope of their new beginning. The choice they made carried layers of meaning that reached back across continents and centuries. They called their settlement Nicodemus, a name whispered with reverence and curiosity. Some said the founders drew their inspiration from the figure who appears in the Gospel of John, a man who sought understanding and renewal under the cover of night. In the scripture, Nicodemus is the seeker who comes to Jesus not in the daylight of certainty, but in the shadowed hours of doubt, searching for a path toward spiritual rebirth. For the men and women who had known bondage, the story resonated like a deep, familiar chord. They too had stepped out of darkness into light, carrying with them the scars of a world that had once denied their humanity. Their journey westward was not merely a change of geography. It was a transformation of spirit, a second birth into a life they themselves would define. Others claimed the name carried a different, though equally powerful, legacy. In the folk traditions carried across the Atlantic by enslaved Africans, tales endured of a prince named Nicodemus, a leader who defied captivity and fought to liberate his people. Whether the story was fact or legend mattered little. What mattered was the symbol it offered, of a man who refused to be broken, who turned oppression into the fire of resistance, for those who had once been held as property. The tale of such a figure offered both a connection to ancestral courage and a reminder that the fight for freedom had never been confined to one time or place. In choosing a name that might honor such a prince, the settlers of Kansas bound their new home to a lineage of resilience that stretched far beyond the borders of America. Perhaps the truth of the name's origin lies somewhere between scripture and legend, between the sacred text and the oral history carried by those whose voices had been silenced for too long. Yet the ambiguity itself was part of its strength. Nicodemus, whether of the Bible or of African lore, stood as a bridge between worlds, the old and the new, the land left behind and the land claimed as their own. It was a name that contained both the yearning for spiritual renewal and the unyielding will to resist. A name that refused to be pinned to a single narrative, just as the people who spoke it refused to be defined by the chains of their past. Under that name, the town began to pulse with life. Children learned their letters in a small schoolhouse, while their parents worked the soil that stretched to the horizon. Sunday mornings filled the air with hymns of praise and gratitude, and on warm summer evenings, music and laughter rose from dances that brought the whole community together. Each gathering was a quiet celebration of the ideals that Nicodemus represented. Liberation not only from the physical bonds of slavery, but from the fear and humiliation that had sought to linger even after emancipation. The name was not simply spoken. It was lived in every seed planted, every log laid, every prayer whispered beneath the endless Kansas sky. Visitors who traveled across the prairie could sense that the name carried a story even before they learned its origins. To step into Nicodemus was to feel the weight of history and the presence of something larger than the modest houses and simple stores. The settlers themselves spoke of the name with pride, knowing it bound them to a narrative of courage that stretched beyond their own lives. It was a word that reminded them that freedom is never merely granted. It is claimed and sustained by those who refuse to surrender their dignity. In time, the name Nicodemus became more than a symbol for the people who lived there. It became a touchstone for Black communities across the nation, a reminder that the quest for liberation is both ancient and ongoing. Whether born of biblical reflection or the legend of an African prince, the name captured the essence of the settlement's spirit. A place where rebirth and resilience were not abstract ideals but daily realities. To speak it aloud was to honor the struggles of those who came before and to affirm the belief that the human spirit, once awakened, cannot be chained again. And so the town stood, its name carried on the prairie winds, a living testament to the power of a single word to hold the hopes of an entire people, and to light the path toward a future built on freedom and unbreakable resolve. The first seasons in Nicodemus tested the settlers in ways few could have imagined when they left the South behind. What began as a dream of self-determination quickly became a daily battle against the merciless realities of life on the Kansas plains. The land stretched wide and empty, a sea of grass that at first glance promised abundance. But those promises were harder to capture than the travelers had hoped. The prairie soil, rich and dark beneath the surface, could yield crops in time, but only to those who had the right tools and the animals strong enough to work the fields. For men and women who arrived with little more than their faith and a few precious belongings, these necessities were heartbreakingly out of reach. They built their first homes not of timber or stone, but of the very earth itself. Without nearby forest to supply wood, families cut blocks of sod from the prairie, stacking them carefully into walls that held back the wind and the bitter chill of Kansas nights. These sod houses, damp and rough, became symbols of both their desperation and their resolve. Inside, smoke from cooking fires mingled with the scent of grass roots, and every creak of the wind outside reminded them how far they had traveled from the world they once knew. They were free now, but freedom alone did not fill the stomachs of their children or shield them from the storms that rolled without warning across the plains. Money was scarce and the equipment needed to break the stubborn ground was costly. The Homestead Act had promised land to those willing to work it, but it did not provide the plows, the seed, or the horses that turned empty acres into thriving farms. Men and women bent their backs to the soil with whatever tools they could fashion or borrow, sometimes tilling the fields by hand, their muscles burning beneath the prairie sun. Days were long and the rewards small. There were moments when the dream of an all-black settlement, a place where they could govern their own lives, seemed dangerously close to slipping away. As the first harsh winter settled in, the community learned the meaning of endurance. Food supplies ran low, and with no guarantee of a successful spring planting, families were forced to stretch every crumb. Mothers cooked what little they had while fathers trudged across miles of open country searching for work with railroad crews or nearby farms, often returning with barely enough wages to keep hunger at bay. Yet even in these bleak months, the settlers found strength in one another. Neighbors shared what they could spare, and when even those modest supplies were exhausted, the people of Nicodemus turned outward, seeking help from private charities and the Native American tribes who lived nearby. Those who had come in search of independence now relied on the kindness of strangers. But their pride did not falter, for they understood that survival itself was an act of resistance. The prairie tested their faith and their unity. Yet it also forged a bond among them that no hardship could break. Every sod house that stood against the relentless wind, every field turned by hand rather than plow, was a testament to their determination. They were not merely building a town. They were proving that their lives, once constrained by the brutal legacy of slavery, could take root and flourish even in the harshest soil. The sound of children's laughter carried across the open land, a fragile but undeniable proof that their hopes still lived. By the spring of 1878, just when the strain threatened to overwhelm them, salvation arrived not in miracles but in the form of new settlers. Waves of black migrants from Kentucky and Mississippi journeyed westward, drawn by the same promise of freedom and land that had first inspired the founders. These newcomers did not come empty-handed. They brought with them wagons loaded with plows, seeds, and horses, along with the hard-won experience of farming in challenging conditions. Most importantly, they brought a renewed sense of purpose and an infusion of cash that breathed life into the struggling community. With the arrival of these new neighbors, the atmosphere in Nicodemus began to change. Fields that had been left untouched now bore the marks of true cultivation. Horses pulled heavy plows through the prairie earth, and the rhythm of work became steadier, more confident. Families who had once feared another winter of scarcity found reason to believe that their settlement could endure. The days of scraping for survival slowly gave way to the first signs of prosperity. Markets grew livelier, and the sound of hammers building new structures joined the chorus of prairie birds. The early hardships left scars that no one forgot, but they also gave the community a story of resilience that would become part of its identity. Those who had survived the first unforgiving months knew that freedom was not a gift delivered, whole and unchallenged. It was something to be earned, defended, and built with calloused hands. The people of Nicodemus carried this truth forward as they worked beside the new arrivals, transforming their settlement from a fragile dream into a living testament to the strength of their spirit. Their sod houses remained as quiet monuments to the grit and courage that had brought them this far, reminders that even in the most barren of landscapes, hope can take root and thrive. By the late 1870s, the windswept prairie that had once seemed endless and empty was now echoing with the sounds of laughter, hymns, and the steady rhythm of hammers striking wood as the settlers of Nicodemus transformed their fragile foothold into a living, breathing town. What had begun as a handful of sod houses scattered across the Kansas plains was evolving into a community whose heartbeat was as strong as the dreams that had drawn these pioneers west. Simple wooden storefronts began to rise where there had once been only tall grass and sky. A general store offered barrels of flour, bolts of fabric, and the precious staples that had been scarce during those first desperate years. Another shop sold tools and farming implements, their polished iron catching the afternoon light and promising a future of productivity. For people who had once arrived with little more than hope and determination, these stores were more than places to trade. They were symbols that their labor had taken root. Churches soon followed, their plain but sturdy walls sheltering voices lifted in songs of gratitude and perseverance. On Sundays, families dressed in their best clothes, some homemade, some carefully saved for during long months of toil, walked together across the prairie paths to gather in worship. The hymns they sang carried stories of both sorrow and triumph, of bondage and the hard-won taste of freedom. In the cadence of those songs, the people of Nicodemus found strength, and in the fellowship of their neighbors, they discovered the comfort of belonging. These churches were more than sanctuaries of faith. They were meeting places where decisions were made, where disputes were settled, and where the bonds of trust that would hold the town together were strengthened week after week. Education, too, became a pillar of their emerging society. A modest schoolhouse, simple in design yet rich in purpose, opened its doors to the children of Nicodemus. For parents who had once been denied the right to read or write, the sight of their sons and daughters bending over their books was a quiet victory that words could scarcely capture. Lessons in arithmetic and letters carried with them the weight of a deeper promise, that the next generation would have the tools to claim a future wider and brighter than their parents had ever dared imagine. The sound of chalk on slate, the murmur of children reciting their lessons, these were the subtle but powerful signs of a community that refused to let the past dictate the limits of its future. Life in Nicodemus was not merely work and worship. It was also celebration. As the seasons turned, the town gathered for dances and public festivities that transformed the prairie nights into spectacles of joy. Lanterns hung from posts, their warm glow casting long shadows as fiddlers played spirited tunes that set feet tapping and hearts racing. Young couples twirled across packed earth floors, elders clapped in rhythm, and laughter rolled across the plains like a friendly wind. These moments of music and dance were more than entertainment, they were declarations of identity. Affirmations that life, even after generations of struggle, could be filled with beauty and delight. Through these gatherings, the settlers of Nicodemus wove together a tapestry of resilience and shared purpose. Each church service, each lesson in the schoolhouse, each evening of dance and celebration stitched another thread into the fabric of a town that stood as a testament to what courage and unity could create. The Great Plains remained vast and often unforgiving, But in this small settlement the spirit of a people who had endured the unthinkable was now indomitable. By the close of the decade, Nicodemus was more than a cluster of buildings. It was the embodiment of a dream fulfilled, a living proof that determination and hope could carve a thriving community from the open prairie. Despite the early vibrancy and hard-won sense of community, Nicodemus soon faced challenges that tested the settlers' resilience in ways the open prairie had never demanded before. The promise of fertile land and abundant harvests that had initially drawn families from Kentucky, Mississippi, and beyond proved to be unpredictable. Years of toil yielded crops that fluctuated wildly, with some seasons bringing a modest bounty and others leaving fields barren despite the sweat and labor invested. In every furrow, droughts struck unexpectedly, scorching the prairie under the relentless sun, while the sudden onset of storms washed away carefully planted seeds and washed hope down rivulets of muddy water. Families who had imagined the land as a source of sustenance and stability now found themselves forced to reckon with its mercurial nature. A reminder that freedom, though priceless, did not shield one from the trials of survival. Adding to the settlers' difficulties, Nicodemus' aspirations of political prominence were dashed when the town failed to secure the designation of county seat for Graham County. The neighboring settlement of Millbrook, with advantages in location and perhaps influence, was selected instead, leaving Nicodemus to contend with the disappointment of unrealized ambition. The designation of a county seat might have brought infrastructure, commerce, and a steady stream of new residents, but the loss left Nicodemus more isolated than ever, its settlers forced to sustain their economy without the boost of administrative prominence. For many residents, this setback was deeply discouraging. The sense that the town could serve as a center of opportunity for black families across the region had been a powerful motivator. And with that vision dimmed, some began to question whether the struggle to remain on the plains was worth the sacrifice. The town's isolation was compounded by the shifting paths of the railroads, the great arteries of commerce and travel that crisscrossed Kansas bypassed Nicodemus, favoring routes that connected larger, more established towns. The settlers had hoped that one of the major rail lines, the Santa Fe, Union Pacific, or Missouri Pacific, would pass through their community, bringing new residents, easier access to markets, and the economic vitality that comes with being a hub of transportation. Instead, surveys and planning led the railroads along other routes, leaving Nicodemus cut off from the lifeblood of trade and opportunity. Farmers struggled to sell their surplus, merchants found fewer customers, and the limited cash flow made it difficult to maintain even the modest infrastructure the town had developed. Those who had arrived with the most determination now faced the sobering reality that their town was unlikely to grow as they had envisioned. Economic stagnation reverberated through every corner of Nicodemus, with commercial lots remaining unpurchased because of high costs and limited buyers. New businesses hesitated to invest, and those already operating struggled to turn a profit. Families who had endured the early years of scarcity now confronted the disheartening realization that resources alone could not guarantee success when broader forces beyond their control, climate, geography, and infrastructure decisions shaped the town's fate. Even the vibrant community gatherings that had once marked the calendar of Nicodemus could not fully mask the growing anxiety. Beneath the music and the dances lay the weight of uncertainty, a subtle acknowledgement that the town's future was precarious. Population loss followed naturally from these economic hardships. Some families moved away in search of better soil, closer connections to the railroads, or more promising towns where trade and opportunity were more reliable. Others sought aid from neighboring communities, or returned temporarily to southern states, where extended family or charitable networks could provide support. The town that had once welcomed hundreds of residents now found its streets quieter, its schoolhouse smaller, and its general stores less frequented. Yet even as numbers dwindled, the people who remained clung to their identity as a self-sustaining black settlement. They refused to let the setbacks erase the decades of labor and hope that had gone in building Nicodemus from the prairie itself. The cumulative effect of poor harvests, political disappointments, and infrastructural exclusion created a sobering landscape in which the settlers' endurance was tested once more. Where optimism had once propelled families forward with the promise of prosperity and security, reality demanded adaptability, patience, and a renewed sense of purpose. Those who remained cultivated not only the land but also the spirit of the community, striving to maintain schools, churches, and the social bonds that defined Nicodemus even as its economic prospects waned. They organized local events and public celebrations to keep the town's heart beating, a conscious effort to sustain morale and remind themselves that survival encompassed more than financial stability. It encompassed culture, memory, and collective resilience. Through these trials, Nicodemus became a living example of persistence in the face of adversity. Its settlers understood that their story was not simply about the success or failure of crops, the outcome of elections, or the routes of railroads. It was about the courage to claim freedom and the determination to shape a community despite forces beyond their control. Though the town faced population loss and economic stagnation, the legacy of those early years of labor, faith, and unyielding hope remained embedded in every structure, every gathering, and every narrative carried forward by those who refused to abandon the promise of Nicodemus. In the vast sweep of the Kansas plains, the town stood as a testament to the enduring power of resilience, a beacon for generations who would later look back and recognize the extraordinary courage of a community that dared to thrive against the odds. Even as the economic hardships of the 1880s and early 1890s threatened to erode the lifeblood of Nicodemus, the town refused to fade from memory or spirit, sustained by traditions and celebrations that bound the community together and reinforced a shared sense of identity. Among the most cherished of these gatherings was the annual Emancipation Day celebration, an event that had begun modestly but grew in scale and significance as years passed. This was not merely a day marked by ceremony. It was a powerful affirmation of freedom, resilience, and the hard-won rights of the African American settlers who had carved a life out of the untamed prairie. Families traveled from miles around to witness and participate in the festivities, bringing with them stories of struggle, survival, and the enduring hope that had led them to Kansas in the first place. The air during these celebrations was thick with music, laughter, and the rhythmic pounding of dance steps on packed earth, a living reminder that the people of Nicodemus were united by both heritage and a commitment to the promise of a better future. In addition to the Emancipation Day events, Black social organizations played an essential role in sustaining the cultural and communal life of Nicodemus. The Masons, the American Legion, and benevolent societies provided not only opportunities for fellowship but also platforms for leadership, mutual aid, and education. These organizations offered practical support, from helping families in need of food and shelter to providing resources for businesses or schooling, and they also served as incubators for civic engagement and collective decision-making. Meetings were filled with spirited debate and planning, fostering a sense of agency and empowerment in a community that had long been denied the simple right to govern its own affairs. The presence of such institutions ensured that even as the town faced depopulation and economic stagnation, its social and moral fabric remained strong. By the 1920s, Nicodemus had become a place where memory and celebration intertwined, attracting visitors from across Kansas and beyond who sought to witness the remarkable perseverance of its residents. The Emancipation Day celebrations during this era were lavish affairs, drawing crowds that sometimes exceeded 2,000 people. Parades wove through the streets, showcasing the vibrancy of a community that refused to succumb to the challenges that had beset it. Boxing matches and sporting competitions entertained young and old alike, while bands and musicians filled the evening air with melodies that carried both joy and a sense of historical continuity. These festivals were not merely for amusement. They were powerful acts of cultural preservation, ensuring that the legacy of Nicodemus, and by extension Black America's struggle and triumph, remained visible and celebrated even as other towns rose and fell across the frontier. The resilience of Nicodemus during this period was remarkable, given the broader context of the Great Plains, the Dust Bowl, economic fluctuations, and the lingering shadows of segregation could have easily extinguished the community spirit. But the people of Nicodemus found ways to maintain both pride and connection, even as some residents left in search of better opportunities. Those who remained invested in the traditions that anchored the town to its history. Churches continued to host gatherings. Schools functioned as centers of learning and social interaction, and every dance, parade, and public event became a testament to the community's ability to endure hardship while celebrating freedom and cultural identity. The Emancipation Day celebrations and the work of Black social organizations also had an outward-facing impact. They drew attention to Nicodemus as a symbol of possibility, demonstrating to other African Americans, both in Kansas and further afield, that it was possible to claim land, establish a community, and preserve cultural integrity even in the face of systemic obstacles. The stories shared during these gatherings, passed down through speeches, songs, and personal recollections, highlighted the successes and struggles of the town's founders and early settlers. These narratives reinforced a collective memory that bound the residents together, reminding them that their efforts were part of a larger continuum of struggle, liberation, and achievement. Even as the town's population fluctuated and economic prospects remained fragile, Nicodemus endured in spirit and in practice. The pride cultivated through Emancipation Day celebrations, social clubs, and benevolent societies reinforced a sense of belonging and purpose that transcended mere survival. Residents recognized that their lives were not only about cultivating crops or maintaining homes. They were about sustaining a legacy of resilience, determination, and communal solidarity. Every parade, dance, and gathering reaffirmed their identity and their connection to the broader story of Black Americans who had sought freedom, justice, and opportunity on the frontier. In essence, Nicodemus during the 1920s exemplified the capacity of a community to thrive culturally and spiritually even when faced with material limitations. It became a beacon of hope and inspiration, a place where history was both remembered and actively celebrated, and where each resident, whether long-term settler or visitor, could feel the weight and beauty of a legacy built on courage, perseverance, and shared purpose. Through these celebrations and organizational efforts, Nicodemus stood as a powerful reminder that even in decline, pride, culture, and identity could flourish, providing lessons not only for the people who lived there but for all who would come to learn from its remarkable story. Today, as the sun rises over the rolling plains of north-central Kansas, Nicodemus stands as a quiet testament to resilience, courage, and the unyielding determination of those who came before. Though only about 23 residents now call the town and its surrounding community home, their presence is far more than a statistic. It is the living embodiment of a history that refuses to be forgotten. Each weathered building, each carefully preserved street, and each stone in the old churches whispers stories of a people who, having endured unimaginable hardships, chose to carve out a life in a land that offered both opportunity and uncertainty. Nicodemus is no longer the bustling settlement it once was in its heyday, but its spirit remains indomitable, echoing the dreams of the African Americans who, after emancipation, looked westward with hope in their hearts and the determination to build something lasting. Walking through the town today, one can almost hear the echoes of the past. The laughter of children running to school, the hymns sung in small wooden churches, the clatter of hooves and wagons along the dusty roads, and the rhythmic pounding of hammers as settlers built homes and businesses with their own hands. Each gesture, each effort of those early pioneers, contributed to a foundation that, despite adversity, has endured for nearly a century and a half. Nicodemus reminds us that the struggle for freedom and self-determination is never confined to a single moment in time. It is carried forward through generations who honor the sacrifices and triumphs of those who came before. The preservation efforts over the decades, often led by the residents themselves, have transformed Nicodemus into more than a historical site. They have made it a living museum of Black resilience. The African Methodist Episcopal Church, which reopened its doors in 2021, stands as a symbol of continuity, faith, and community. It is here, and in the efforts of the Nicodemus Historical Society and Community Center, that the legacy of self-reliance and cultural pride lives on. Tours, events, and educational programs bring visitors from across the country, allowing them to witness firsthand the achievements of a people who defied enormous odds to create a lasting settlement. In doing, Nicodemus educates, inspires, and ensures that the narrative of Black pioneers on the frontier is neither overlooked nor forgotten. Nicodemus' story is not only one of survival, it is a powerful illustration of the values of perseverance, ingenuity, and communal solidarity. From the early settlers who braved the plains with nothing but their determination and dreams, to the later generations who worked tirelessly to maintain the town's structures and traditions. Every chapter reflects an unwavering commitment to freedom and dignity. The town's legacy is particularly significant in the context of American history, where the stories of Black pioneers often remain overshadowed by other narratives. Nicodemus stands as a counterpoint, asserting that African Americans were not only participants but leaders in shaping the frontier, confronting systemic oppression while building communities of strength, culture, and hope. Even today, the lessons of Nicodemus resonate. It teaches us that progress is rarely linear, that adversity can challenge even the strongest communities. And yet, with dedication and shared purpose, collective vision can endure across generations. The town's continued existence, modest in scale though profound in meaning, embodies the idea that perseverance and courage are not measured solely by material success, but by the ability to maintain identity, culture, and pride in the face of historical and ongoing challenges. Visitors to Nicodemus are reminded that every road, building, and preserved site tells a story of determination, a story that challenges us to reflect on our own lives, our communities, and the ways we honor the legacies of those who came before us. As we reflect on the remarkable journey of Nicodemus, it becomes clear that this town is more than a settlement. It is a symbol of hope and possibility. It embodies the triumph of vision and resilience over hardship, of unity and shared purpose over isolation, and of cultural pride over erasure. The story of Nicodemus encourages us to recognize the value of history not as a distant past, but as a living narrative that informs and inspires the present and future. For those who walk its streets, who explore its historic sites, and who listen to the stories passed down through generations, Nicodemus offers a profound reminder. The spirit of perseverance, courage, and determination can endure, even when faced with overwhelming odds. Thank you so much for watching this journey into the remarkable history of Nicodemus, the legendary Black pioneer town that stands as a testament to human courage and communal strength. If you enjoyed this video and want to continue exploring stories of resilience, history, and cultural triumph, do not forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Your support allows us to bring more inspiring stories like this to life, and to honor the incredible people who shaped our shared past. From all of us here, we wish you a peaceful night filled with reflection, gratitude, and the quiet joy of learning something new. Good night, and may your dreams be as bold and enduring as the legacy of Nicodemus.